Somewhere at the edge of known space, a ship is falling. Not fast, not dramatically, just the slow, inevitable descent of something that has traveled too far, on too little groaning, through the upper atmosphere of a planet it was never meant to reach, toward a city so clean and ordered, it looks like a place that has never once made a mistake. The market below is alive. Thousands of voices, 1,000 transactions. The ordinary, beautiful noise of a civilization that has decided it knows what it is. Then something changes. The crowd goes quiet, not all at once, in a wave, like a held breath moving through water. She appears at the far end of the concourse, pale gold hair, white as birch, tall, composed, the kind of woman who moves through space and the space moves around her. She stops, not slows, stops. Her guards don't understand why. Neither do we. She is looking at a stranger's neck, at something small, faded, almost invisible, and her face is doing something it was never built to do in public. She takes one step forward, then another, and whatever was about to happen to this man's ordinary afternoon ends. Part 1, the wrong stop. The ship made a sound like a dying suggestion. Not an explosion, not a warning siren, just a low, tired groan from somewhere deep in the engine housing, the kind of sound that meant, "This is not a request, and you will be landing now, and I don't care where." Rael Voss had been flying long enough to know the difference between a mechanical complaint and a mechanical ultimatum. This was an ultimatum. He pulled up the nav display, scanned the nearest viable coordinates, found one planet close enough to matter, stable enough to not kill him on approach, and according to the registry, civilized enough to have a parts dealer who wouldn't ask too many questions. Arendal. He'd never been, never planned to go. But the ship had opinions now, and Rael was outvoted. He adjusted course and let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest for about 3 systems too long. Fine, he thought. One stop. Fix the drive coupling. Buy coolant. Leave. Simple. He was good at simple. Simple was the only thing that had kept him alive the last 15 years of bouncing between systems with no fixed address, no standing contracts, and no particular reason to stay anywhere long enough to become someone's problem. Simple was the plan. Arendal had other ideas. The planet came into view through the cockpit screen like something out of an architecture magazine that didn't know when to stop. Clean, ordered, almost aggressively beautiful. Towers that curved instead of rising straight. Platforms threading the air at staggered heights. Transit pods gliding between them on paths that looked less like infrastructure and more like calligraphy. The whole city spread out below like someone had decided that chaos was optional and removed it permanently by committee vote. Rael pressed his forehead against the viewport, pulled back immediately, left a mark, wiped it with his sleeve. The landing approach went smoother than expected. The ship was still groaning, but politely now, the mechanical equivalent of a person who complains loudly at home but holds it together in public. The landing pad accepted him without fanfare, just a soft thud, a satisfying series of clicks as the docking clamps engaged. He sat for a moment in the silence. Then he grabbed his jacket, checked that the collar sat high enough to cover most of the tattoo on his neck. Habit, not shame, mostly habit, and headed for the ramp. The air outside hit him immediately. Cool, faintly ionized, the kind of clean that suggested filtration at a molecular level and a government that took infrastructure seriously. Rael inhaled once. Parts dealer. Coolant. Out by morning. He walked. The spaceport market was the kind of place that spent a lot of money pretending money didn't matter. Floors that gleamed, holographic displays layered 3 deep above every vendor stall, advertising things no reasonable person strictly needed. Crowds that moved with direction and confidence, not rushing, not afraid, just going somewhere the way people moved when their city had figured out what it was doing. Rael blended in easily. Drifters always did. There was something useful about looking like you belonged everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Keep the jacket half-zipped, scuff the boots, posture loose, not threatening, not available, just present. The practiced stance of someone who expected the day to get complicated but refused to accelerate that timeline. He was examining a tray of something that pulsed with soft, bioluminescent light fruit, probably or possibly a life form that had given up moving when he found the parts dealer stall. Small, cluttered, run by a creature with 4 upper limbs and the general energy of someone who had seen everything twice and found it tedious both times. The drive coupling was available. Overpriced. Rael negotiated for 4 minutes and settled for overpriced but slightly less, which was the realistic ceiling. He tucked the part under his arm. Coolant next, then protein packs, then gone. He was 3 stalls over when the crowd changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was subtle the way a temperature drop is subtle. You don't notice the moment it happens, only that suddenly you're colder than you were. Conversations dipped. Footsteps slowed. A ripple moved through the market like a collective breath being held by people who had practiced holding it. Rael glanced up, mildly annoyed. Usually this meant officials or inspections or someone about to make his day considerably more bureaucratic. He considered leaving it immediately. Then the air tightened. She came from the far end of the concourse. He saw the guards first, layered armor that hummed at a frequency just below hearing, weapons at rest but present, eyes forward with the particular alertness of people paid to be nervous so no one else had to be. Then he saw her. Queen Thessaly of Arundel moved the way certain people moved, not demanding attention so much as collecting it the way a gravitational body collected things that passed too close. Not rushed, not performing, simply inevitable. She was striking. That was the word Rael's brain reached for and then immediately questioned. Not beautiful the way advertisements were beautiful, polished to the point of abstraction. This was different, sharper, more real. Hair the color of old winter light, pale gold, nearly white falling straight past her shoulders. Skin like white birch in morning. And the ears, long, curved gently backward through the fall of her hair. The mark of her species. Elegant rather than exotic, the way evolution sometimes arrived at solutions that also happened to be lovely. She looked, Rael thought, like someone who had survived something and come out the other side of it composed. Not unscathed. Composed. He knew that look. He'd spent 15 years perfecting a version of it himself. He immediately looked away, because looking at queens tended to end poorly and he had a drive coupling to install. It didn't help. He was reaching for a packet of protein rations when the vendor froze. Not paused. Froze. Hands mid-reach, eyes fixed somewhere past Rael's left shoulder. Rael turned slowly. The queen had stopped walking. She was at mid-concourse. Her guards had stopped with her exchanging glances with the controlled confusion of people whose job description did not include the monarch has spotted something and we don't know what it is. She was not looking at Rael's face. She was looking at his neck, more specifically at the collar of his jacket, which had shifted during the negotiation with the parts dealer, which had slipped just enough to reveal the edge of the tattoo. A simple thing, the tattoo. Lines and numbers in a pattern that meant exactly one thing to exactly one profession on exactly one planet in this sector of known space. A medical identification mark. Standard issue for field medics who operated in conflict zones. The kind of thing you got when you went to work in places where dog tags weren't enough and someone needed to be able to identify your credentials from a distance. Rael had worn it so long he'd stopped seeing it. He scratched at it now the way he always did without thinking. And Queen Thessaly of Arundel went completely still. The stillness lasted 4 seconds. Rael counted. It was the kind of moment that demanded counting. Then she stepped forward. Her guards reacted instantly, a shift in formation, hands moving toward weapons, voices low and urgent at her shoulder. She ignored them. Each step was measured, deliberate. The steps of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in renegotiating it at this time or any future time. Rael stood very still. Don't run, he told himself. Running makes it worse. Also, you left the ship 3 levels up and you'd never make it. Also, don't run. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the specific quality of her eyes. Blue-gray, the color of deep water before a storm, and the way they were fixed on his neck with an expression he could not categorize. Not anger, not suspicion. Something rawer than either. Up close she looked tired. Not old. Tired. In the particular way of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has gotten proficient at not letting anyone see the weight. He knew that look too. Her guards had formed a perimeter around them both, which was probably the most awkward social geometry Rael had experienced in recent memory. For a moment, no one said anything. Then she said, I know that, Mark. Her voice was low, steady. The kind of voice built on years of needing to be heard in rooms full of people who would rather not listen. Rael waited. Nothing else happened. No arrest, no weapons drawn. Just a queen staring at his neck like it had personally rewritten her understanding of reality. He cleared his throat. That's interesting, because unless you've met someone with terrible tattoo taste before, I think there might be some confusion. Her eyes moved to his face, sharp, focused, carrying something old. You bear his mark, she said. Rael produced a careful smile. I bear a lot of questionable decisions. That one's just permanent. Something crossed her face. Not amusement. Something that lived in the neighborhood of pain. You will come with me, she said. Rael sighed. I was really hoping to finish shopping first. For just a moment, one unrepeatable moment, something like relief crossed her features. Of course, she said quietly. He complained about interruptions too. The smile left Rael's face before he could stop it. Before he could ask what that meant, who he was, who she was talking about with that particular weight in her voice, the guards moved in. Not roughly, professionally. The crowd exhaled slowly. Noise returned to the market in cautious increments. And Rael Voss, who had stopped at Arundel for a drive coupling and some protein rations, was guided away from the market with the drive coupling still under one arm and the growing unshakable feeling that Simple had once again failed him completely. The transport was quieter than he expected, not silent. The gravitic drive hummed at a frequency that sat in the back teeth. Outside the transparent panels, Arundel's capital unfolded beneath them, ordered, layered, unhurried. A city that had decided what it was and committed to it centuries ago. Rael pressed his forehead to the glass for exactly 2 seconds, pulled back when a guard cleared their throat. Right. Queen Thessaly sat across from him. She had not looked away since they left the market. Not at his neck anymore, at his face. The way someone studied a map they weren't sure how to read. He let her look. He was good at being looked at without offering anything back. 15 years of practice. The silence stretched. You resemble him, she said at last. Rael blinked. That's concerning considering I've never met whoever you're referring to. You have not. Not unless we're counting people in markets who escort me places without much explanation. He gestured vaguely at the guards. In which case, new record today. Her eyes narrowed. Not anger. Focus. The kind that preceded actual questions. You do not know who bore that mark before you. It's a family mark, Rael said, carefully, the word family coming out slightly harder than he intended, like pressing on a bruise to check if it still hurt. It did. From my father, he was a medic, field service, long-range assignments. He stopped, edited, started again. He left when I was 9, didn't leave much behind. The transport glided around a long curve. The palace came into view ahead, vast and pale against the sky rising from the city, like something that had grown rather than been built. Thessaly watched him. He left something, she said quietly. He left you. Rael looked at the floor. Generous reading, he said. She didn't respond to that, but something in her shoulders changed, a fraction of tension released, as if she'd been bracing for something and found it slightly less sharp than expected. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Rael watched the palace approach and thought about 9-year-olds who wait by doors. He stopped thinking about it after a moment. He was very good at stopping. The palace did not feel like a place built for comfort. It felt curated, every surface considered, every proportion intentional. The kind of space where centuries of rulers had made decisions about what mattered and removed everything that didn't. Rael walked through corridors that curved in ways his spatial reasoning wanted to argue with. The floors responded to footsteps with soft light, acknowledging presence, confirming existence, providing illumination that felt slightly judgmental. He lifted one foot. The light followed. At least the floor knows I'm real, he muttered. A servant appeared at his elbow with the unnerving precision of someone who had been waiting exactly there. She bowed to the queen, paused when she saw Rael, reassessed, clearly running through protocols and finding none that covered human drifter jacket, with a stained mild expression of existential concern. He gave her a polite nod, the universal gesture of someone who did not belong but wished to avoid offending anyone with scheduling authority. Thessaly led him through the curving corridors without looking back to check that he was following. He was. He was also cataloging exits by habit, not because he planned to use them, but because 15 years of uncertain stops in uncertain places had made it a reflex. He couldn't turn off even in architecturally impressive palaces on planets he'd never meant to visit. They entered a room that was smaller than he expected. Warmer, not a throne room, not an audience chamber. A retreat. The walls were etched with star charts, not decorative, not symbolic real ones. Current ones. The kind you kept when space wasn't just metaphor, but actual lived reality. A wide window looked out over the city below, lights moving in patterns, life continuing at altitude. Thessaly gestured at a chair. Rael chose the one that looked least ceremonial. Sat. The chair adjusted. "Oh," he said, "that's dangerously comfortable." She stood near the window, arms at her sides, not relaxed, composed. There was a difference. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You owe me a slightly shorter afternoon," Rael said. "But yes, explanation works." She turned to face him fully, and something shifted in her posture. Not weakness, not performance. Just the slight adjustment of someone setting down armor that had gotten heavy. 15 years ago, she began. Rael waited. "I was not a queen." "Most people aren't," he said. "At 23. She looked at him. "I was a soldier," she said. "A junior officer. There was a border conflict in a system I will not name. My unit was taken. We were transported to an off-world detention facility, no names used, no ranks recognized, only numbers." Her gaze went to the middle distance. "I was young. I believed survival was a matter of personal strength." "It isn't," Rael said. "No, it is not." She looked back at him. "It is endurance, and unexpectedly kindness." The word landed quietly in the room between them. Rael didn't joke. He recognized with the instinct of someone who'd had a lot of practice in his own way that this was one of those moments where humor would not be the right tool. He filed it away and stayed quiet. "There was a human medic in the facility," she continued. "A prisoner. He wore your mark." Her eyes went briefly to his neck, then back. "He treated everyone, including the guards who mistreated him. He shared his food. He taught anyone who would listen how to slow their breathing when pain became—" She paused, found the word. "Unmanageable." Rael's chest did something he wasn't prepared for. He kept his face still. "Practice." "He told jokes," she said. "Terrible ones." A sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh, close. "That tracks." She looked at him sharply. "You knew him." "I knew someone who told terrible jokes," Rael said. The next word came out before he could organize it into something less exposed. "My father." The weight of those two syllables surprised him. They usually didn't. He'd had a lot of years to make them lighter. Apparently the journey to Arendelle had reversed some of that work. He pushed on. "He disappeared when I was 9. Left behind a tattoo, a box of things that didn't explain anything, and a lot of questions that never got answers." Outside the window, the city moved its quiet patterns. Patrol craft tracing arcs. Life continuing without consulting Rael's feelings about it. Thessaly was very still. "He died in that facility," she said. Quiet, careful, like she was handling something that might break if mismanaged. Buying time for others to escape. There was a transport out. He stayed behind to secure the route. Rael stared at the floor, at his boots reflected in the polished surface. At nothing, really. "He always was bad at leaving quietly," he said. "He meant it to come out lighter than it did. It didn't come out light at all." The silence that followed was the kind that didn't need to be filled. Thessaly moved to a console near the window and activated a small holographic display. An image materialized, sparse and gray. The skeletal structure of a facility that no longer existed, orbiting a dead moon. Cold corridors, restraint fields rendered in faint blue. The aesthetic of a place designed for containment and nothing else. Rael looked at it. He looked at it the way you looked at something you'd spent a long time trying not to imagine, and were now seeing confirmed. "He kept me alive," Thessaly said. Simple, not dramatic, just the fact of it placed plainly in front of him. Not through force, not through heroics, through consistency. Every morning, he was the same person. Steady, kind. When everything else in that place was designed to make you forget who you were, he remembered. Out loud, in front of everyone. Medics are like that, Rael said. His voice was slightly less steady than he would have preferred, inconveniently principled. He spoke of you. Rael went still. That's impossible, he said. Automatic, defensive. He said he had a child. She faced him. He said he worried he would be forgotten. Rael swallowed. He looked at his hands for a moment, the tattoo at his neck, the drive coupling he'd set on the side table when he'd sat down still there, slightly incongruous against the palace's restrained elegance. He wasn't, Rael said quietly, forgotten. Then because he was Rael Voss and he needed somewhere to put the feeling before it got too big for the room, resented occasionally, confused about regularly, told terrible jokes in memory of more than I'd admit, but not forgotten. The hologram faded. Thessaly faced him fully. She was studying him again. Not the way she'd studied him in the market with shock, with the ghost recognition of someone seeing a face they'd mourned. This was different, slower. The way you studied something real, something present, that you were trying to understand on its own terms. I summoned you here, she said, because I carry a debt. You didn't summon me, Rael said. You had large people make a suggestion I didn't feel positioned to decline. The corner of her mouth moved, almost something. I owe him, she said, and you are what remains of him. Rael leaned back, looked at the ceiling, looked back at her. I don't need compensation, he said. I didn't even know there was an outstanding bill. That does not change what is owed, she said. On Arundel, debts are not dissolved because they are inconvenient. Must be nice. He stretched his legs out. Where I come from, people ignore them until they become someone else's problem. Another silence. Easier this time. She sat finally. Not ceremonially, just sat. The posture changed. Slightly less queen, slightly more person. You joke at the edge of everything, she said. Cheaper than therapy, Rael replied, and more portable. He did the same, she said, not fond exactly, but close. In the worst moments, he made them slightly less sharp. Not smaller, just less sharp. Rael looked at her, at this person who had been a soldier at 23 in a facility she was not supposed to survive, who had come back, who had built something out of the aftermath, whose hands were folded with practiced stillness in her lap, and whose eyes were the color of deep water before a storm. He thought my father sat across from her once, in a different room, a worse one. He thought she's still here because he stayed. He thought I never knew he could do something like that. He thought a lot of things he didn't say. You can't repay him, Rael said finally. You know that. I know, she said, but I can know his son. He was given rooms. Better rooms than he'd slept in since he calculated a particularly lucrative cargo run 4 years ago, when he'd briefly had disposable income and spent most of it immediately on the room. The ceiling was adaptive, the lighting was warm. A window overlooked the city from a height that made all the ordered patterns below look like something someone had drawn slowly and carefully with the full intention of getting it right. Rael sat on the edge of the bed, set the drive coupling on the nightstand, looked at it. Parts dealer. Coolant. Leave by morning, he'd said. He'd had a plan. He reached up and touched the tattoo on the side of his neck. Traced the lines he knew by feel better than by sight. He'd stopped being able to see them clearly in mirrors years ago, which was probably metaphorical, and he chose not to examine that. His father's mark, his father's number. His father's credential worn on a dead man's son's neck for 33 years, neither of them knowing what it had already meant to someone else. He lay back on the bed, stared at the ceiling. The ceiling showed him a slow-moving star field, which he had not requested, but which he had to admit was a reasonably thoughtful response to being a person who'd spent most of his adult life moving between them. He thought about a 9-year-old standing at a door. He thought about a man in a facility on a dead moon teaching a young soldier how to breathe through pain. He thought about terrible jokes. He thought he didn't leave because he didn't care. He thought he left because of something larger than he stopped. He wasn't ready to finish that sentence. Not yet. Not tonight in this palace, in this city, on this planet he'd never meant to land on. But, and this was new, this was genuinely new, he didn't push the thought away either. He let it sit there, unfinished, waiting. Outside Arundel arranged itself in its careful geometry of light and order. Below, people moved through a city that had been shaped by someone's idea of what was possible. Above, stars continued their long, slow, entirely indifferent business. Rael Voss closed his eyes, and for the first time in a very long time didn't feel like he was just passing through. He woke to soft light. The ceiling had decided dawn should be gradual and emotionally supportive, which Rael found slightly presumptuous but couldn't fully object to. He lay there for a moment, stared at the drive coupling on the nightstand. Thought I should fix the ship today. Thought I should buy coolant. Thought I should... A chime sounded at the door. Soft, discreet, the kind of sound that asked rather than announced. He sat up, rubbed his face, oriented himself to the fact that he was in a palace, on Arendal, because his ship had made an ultimatum and the queen of the planet had seen his tattoo in a marketplace. Right, he said to no one. That happened. The door parted. A servant, the same one from yesterday, still working through her protocol confusion regarding him, stood in the corridor. And behind her, not needing introduction and not waiting for one Queen Thessaly. Today she wore simpler garments, still unmistakably regal. There was something in how she occupied space that didn't simplify regardless of what she put on, but less armored, more present. The long ears angled slightly back in the way he was already beginning to read his caution. Not hostility, caution. The difference mattered. I hope I am not intruding, she said. Rael looked at her, at the drive coupling, at her. If this is an arrest, he said, I'd like to request coffee first. The corner of her mouth moved. More than yesterday. You are not under arrest. That significantly improves my morning. He gestured at the room. Come in then. The ceiling gave me a whole personalized sunrise. It'd be a shame not to share it. She stepped inside, dismissed the servant with a glance. The door sealed, and the room became slightly smaller, in the way rooms did when the space between two people shifted from formal distance to something less categorizable. She moved to the window. He stayed on the bed's edge, elbows on knees, watching her watch the city. The council is aware of your presence, she said. Excellent, Rael said. I love being a topic. They are concerned. She kept her gaze on the city. Your presence here creates questions. About what? About what you represent. She turned. You are the son of a man who saved a future queen. That carries weight whether you intend it to or not. Rael looked at his hands. I came to buy a drive coupling, he said. I represent nothing. I'm barely representing myself on a good day. That is not how it will be read. Then how will it be read? She was quiet for a moment. The city moved below. Ordered, certain. Some will see a symbol, she said. Some will see a vulnerability. Some will see a debt being paid publicly, which they will interpret as weakness. And what do you see? She looked at him directly. Someone who doesn't know yet what he's walked into, she said, and who deserves to know before it becomes relevant. Rael held her gaze. Outside, a formation of patrol craft glided past in perfect formation, silent from this height, purposeful. He thought about the way she'd stood in the market, the moment of stillness, the guards confused around her, the expression on her face when she'd seen the mark on his neck, not recognition exactly. Something older than recognition. He said, tell me the rest. She studied him. The rest, she said carefully, is more complicated. I've got time, Rael said. Then actually, I've got a ship with a faulty drive coupling and a vague sense that my schedule is no longer mine. So, same thing. She sat down. Not the chair across from him, the one beside the window, close enough to be in the same conversation, far enough to maintain something. And she began to talk. She talked for a long time. Not about the facility this time, about afterward, about the years between surviving and becoming, the return to Arendal, the political landscape she'd come back to, the work of rebuilding not just herself, but the credibility of a planet that had made decisions during that conflict it would need decades to reckon with. Rael listened. He was a good listener, another useful drifter skill. When you pass through a lot of places, you got practiced at giving people the space to say what they needed to say without filling it with yourself. But this was different from listening to port gossip or cargo broker complaints. This was different because every few sentences, something in what she said connected to something in what he knew or hadn't known, the enormous territory of what he hadn't known about Dorian Voss. He used to say, she said at one point, that most problems could be survived if you had enough curiosity left to want to see what came next. Rael had to look at the floor for a moment, because he'd heard that, not in those words, but in the shape of them. In a version of that idea compressed into the 2 or 3 things his father had said to him before he left that Rael had carried without knowing he was carrying anything. He thought he told her things he was still telling me years apart. He thought, we both got different pages of the same letter. He didn't say that, but he thought it. When she finally stopped talking, the city outside had moved from early morning into something more fully itself. Busier, brighter, going about its day with no particular interest in the conversations happening in palace windows above it. Rael leaned back. You've been carrying this for 15 years, he said. Yes. The gratitude. Yes. And the guilt, he said, that he didn't make it. She didn't answer immediately. Yes, she said at last. Quieter. Rael nodded. He thought about what it would mean to set something down that you'd misidentified for decades. He thought that was probably a tomorrow problem, or a next week problem. You know, he said, for someone who runs a planet with this much polished floor space, you seem like a relatively normal person. She looked at him. That is possibly the strangest compliment I have received. I'm told my delivery needs work. He stood, stretched, picked up the drive coupling. I'm going to fix my ship today. You are leaving. I'm fixing my ship. Those aren't the same thing. He headed for the door, stopped, turned back. And for what it's worth, he did know that you made it. He paused. Let that sit. He must have known. People like that, the ones who stay behind on purpose, they don't do it without believing it'll mean something. He knew. Her expression shifted, something opening in it. He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked out into the curved corridor with its thoughtful floor lighting, into the vast ordered house of a planet that had not expected him and wasn't entirely sure what to do with him yet. Behind him, Arundel's queen sat by her window, and perhaps for the first time in 15 years, the weight she was carrying felt slightly different. Not lighter, just less wrong. He fixed the ship. It took 4 hours of vocabulary expansion and mechanical profanity, and a calibration tool borrowed from a palace maintenance worker who had simply handed it over without asking questions, possibly because Rael's expression had conveyed, I am a man on the edge of a technical crisis, and I will be civil, but barely. The drive coupling seated correctly on the third attempt. He stood in the engine bay, hands dark with grease, and felt the drive hum back to life under his palms. Steady, even, reliable. Good, he thought. I could leave now. He stood there a moment longer. The city stretched beyond the landing platform's edge, ordered and lit and going about its considerable business. He thought about a woman who had sat with a dead man's memory for 15 years, who had become a queen in the meantime, who had walked across a crowded marketplace toward a stranger because she'd seen a mark she recognized and had apparently decided in the space of a single breath that some things mattered more than protocol. He thought my father would have done the same thing. He thought, God help me, I might be more like him than I knew. He wiped his hands on a cloth that didn't help, put his jacket back on, adjusted the collar, and walked back into the palace. Not because he'd been summoned, not because he owed anyone anything, because somewhere in the day's strange unfolding simple had become something else entirely, something with more dimension, more history, more of that particular inconvenient weight that accumulated when you started learning the actual shape of things you'd carried wrong for 30 years. The drive could wait. The coolant could wait. He had time. For the first time in a long time, he had something worth staying for long enough to find out. The floor lit up under his feet. He almost thanked it. Part 2. Learning a Stranger. By the third day, Rael had learned 4 things about palace life. 1. The walls listened. Not literally, probably not literally, but information moved through this building the way heat moved through metal, invisibly efficiently and faster than seemed physically reasonable. He'd mentioned offhand to a maintenance worker that he preferred his morning drink without sweetener. By the next morning, it arrived exactly that way. No one asked, no one confirmed. It simply happened. The palace knew things. Two, the food was aggressively good, not in a showy way, in a quiet, considered way that made Rael suspicious of his own enjoyment. He was used to protein packs and whatever was cheapest at whatever port he'd stopped at. This was something else entirely. Every meal arrived timed perfectly, portioned thoughtfully, and tasting like someone had actually thought about the experience of eating it. He didn't trust it. He ate everything anyway. 3, everyone was watching him. Not obviously. No one stared. No one followed at visible distance. But he felt it, the quality of attention in a room when he walked through it. The slight adjustment of posture from servants, the particular careful neutrality of guards when they passed him in corridors, the way conversations paused at a frequency just above natural. He was being observed and assessed and categorized. He was used to this. Drifters got this in most ports. The difference here was the scale of it. This wasn't one suspicious cargo broker sizing him up. This was an entire institution trying to figure out what he was. 4 Thessaly came to find him. Every morning, not announced, not formal, just present, at the window, at the door. Once memorably sitting on a low bench in the corridor outside his rooms, as if she'd been there for a while and hadn't particularly minded. He'd opened his door and nearly walked into her. She'd looked up, perfectly composed, like sitting in palace corridors at early morning was an entirely expected activity. "Good morning," she'd said. He'd looked at her, at the corridor, at her. "How long have you been there?" "Not long." "That's not a specific answer." "No," she'd agreed. And somehow that had been the beginning of an hour-long conversation about nothing that mattered and everything that did, about the nature of planetary governance and its tendency to make people forget what actual people needed, about the specific loneliness of being in charge of things, about bad jokes, about his father, always eventually about his father. On the 4th morning, she didn't come. Rael noticed at a time he wasn't proud of noticing. Early, before the ceiling had finished its slow performance of gradual dawn. He told himself he wasn't waiting. He made the drink the palace had learned he preferred, sat by the window, watched the city arrange itself into its daily patterns, told himself again. Then a different knock came. Not the soft chime he'd gotten used to, a harder sound. Official. He opened the door to a council aide, young, precise, carrying a data tablet with the energy of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say. "Lord Voss," the aide began. "Not a lord," Rael said. A pause, recalibration. "Mr. Voss, Commander Draven requests an audience." Rael considered that. Commander Draven. He'd heard the name twice in 3 days. Once from a servant's conversation he wasn't supposed to overhear. Once from Thessaly herself, mentioned briefly and moved past quickly, the kind of quick that meant she'd noticed she was about to say more and had decided not to. The kind of quick that meant something. "Does Commander Draven explain what he wants?" Rael asked. "He extends a courtesy meeting," the aide said carefully, "as a senior member of the advisory council, to welcome you." Welcome you. The way the aide said it had about the same warmth as a legal document. "Sure," Rael said. "Tell him I'll be there." Commander Draven was 60-something, possibly more. The kind of age that didn't happen by accident. It had been constructed layer by layer, decision by decision, across a long career of making choices in rooms where the stakes were always too high and the time was never enough. He was tall, still, the kind of stillness that came from decades of discipline rather than natural calm. He received Rael in a small council anteroom. No audience, no formality, just 2 chairs, a low table, and the specific atmosphere of a conversation that had been planned to look unplanned. "Mr. Voss," he gestured at the opposite chair. "Please." Rael sat, kept his posture easy, unhurried. Draven looked at him for a moment, assessing. "Then you are not what I expected." "I get that a lot," Rael said, "usually followed by something interesting." "You've been here 4 days." "I have. Her Majesty has given you considerable access." "She's been generous," Rael agreed. "Careful. You understand," Draven said, "that your presence here is complicated." "People keep saying that," Rael said. "No one's explained specifically why." Draven's hands rested on his knees. Still, patient. Arundel has spent 12 years building relationships with neighboring systems that were damaged during the conflict period. What the Queen carries about your father is real. I don't question its sincerity. A pause. But sentiment displayed publicly can be read as weakness by people who look for vulnerabilities. And I'm the sentiment, Rael said. You are the visible evidence of a debt the Queen feels, which in the wrong hands becomes leverage. Rael looked at him. At the stillness, the patience, the absolutely calibrated expression of a man who had been in rooms like this one for a very long time. You're not welcoming me, Rael said. Draven didn't blink. I am advising you. Right, Rael leaned back. What's the advice? Consider whether your presence here serves anyone. A pause that lasted exactly long enough. Including yourself. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the palace's deeper corridors, something mechanical hummed steadily. Reliable. Indifferent. Rael looked at Draven. He thought this man is not wrong exactly. He thought this man is also not telling me everything. He thought these two things can both be true. I'll consider it, Rael said, and he smiled pleasantly and meant absolutely none of it. He found Thessaly in the archive. Not by plan, by following a palace servant who was delivering something in that direction and then continuing past the delivery point because the architecture curved that way, and he was curious, and the palace had excellent corridor acoustics. The archive was vast, cool, lined with data stacks that held records going back. He glanced at a date marker, 300 years. The kind of institutional memory that made individual human lives feel very small and very brief. Thessaly stood at a reading station in the middle of it. Alone. No aides, no guards within visible range. Just her and a holographic display showing documents he couldn't read from the doorway. She heard him come in. Didn't look up. You spoke with Draven. Not a question. How did you? The aide who collected you was assigned to his office. She turned a document over. He moves quickly when he's concerned. Rael crossed the room, stopped at a respectful distance from her station. He thinks I should leave, Rael said. He thinks many things should happen differently than they are happening. She finally looked up. He is occasionally right. Only occasionally. He is a man who has governed by careful calculation for 30 years. She turned back to the display. Calculation is useful. It is not everything. Rael watched her for a moment. Watched the way she moved through the documents, efficient, practiced but with a quality of concentration that wasn't just professional. Personal, like she was looking for something specific. What are you reading, he asked. She paused, a pause too long to be nothing. Records, she said. Records of what? Another pause. And in that pause, in the specific texture of it, Rael felt something shift. The way a room changed pressure before weather arrived. Small, definite. Old records, she said, from 15 years ago. He stepped closer, not close enough to intrude, close enough to see. The display showed administrative logs, dense text, date stamps from 15 years ago. One column, recurring header. Transfer request prisoner exchange. He read it once, then again. His eyes moved through the text with the kind of careful attention you gave to things you weren't sure you were understanding correctly, hoping the second reading would produce a different result. It didn't. A prisoner exchange request, submitted through formal channels. 15 years ago. From inside the Varath facility. A list of prisoners eligible for negotiated release. Medics listed separately flagged under a humanitarian provision. At the bottom of the first page, a name. D. Voss Field Medic registered credential. The credential number was his tattoo. Exactly his tattoo. Character by character. Rael stood very still. He filed a request, he said. Thessaly said nothing. Rael stopped. Started again. He was trying to get out. Yes. The word was very quiet. And this is, he looked at the next page, the response column. A single notation stamped in the formal script of Arundel's administrative authority. Request reviewed. Denied strategic assessment. Conflict period authority. And below it, a signatory. 2 lines. A title. Commander D. Draven, Strategic Advisory Conflict period authority. Rael read it 3 times. He turned around. He walked to the end of the archive aisle. He stood there with his back to the reading station for a moment. His hands were doing the thing they'd done in the transport 4 days ago. The slight tremor he couldn't fully control. The one that showed up when something landed too close to the place he'd spent 30 years fortifying. He tried, he thought. He filed a request. He went through the proper channels. He did everything you were supposed to do. He tried to come home. The thought arrived whole and complete and with full force. He tried to come home and someone said no. He came back to the reading station. He didn't trust his voice completely, but he used it anyway. "When did you find this?" he asked. "This morning," Thessaly said. She hadn't moved. Her hands were flat on the edge of the station. "I have been reviewing records since you arrived. I wanted to understand fully what happened, what I knew, what I had not looked at." "You didn't know about this?" "No." Clear, direct. "I knew a request had been made by someone in the facility. I did not know who. The records from that period were difficult to access. Some were sealed. I have clearance now that I did not have before." Rael looked at the name on the denial, at the title, at the date. "He thought Draven told me this morning to consider leaving." He thought this morning, after I'd been here 4 days, after Thessaly had been pulling old records. He thought he knew I might find this, or she might, and he moved first. "Does he know you've seen this?" Rael asked. "Not yet." "He will." "Yes." She looked at the document. "He will." Quiet. The archive hummed around them. 300 years of institutional memory filed and stacked and accessible to the right person with the right clearance asking the right questions. "Thessaly," Rael said. She looked at him. Was denying this request, was that a defensible decision? At the time, she considered that, really considered it, not quickly. "The conflict period was volatile," she said carefully. "Exchange negotiations were complicated. Some decisions made then that appear wrong now appear differently in context." A pause. "But this specific request," she stopped. "What?" "The humanitarian provision under which it was filed," she said slowly, "was created specifically to exempt medical personnel from standard strategic calculations. Medics, non-combatants. The provision existed so that exactly this kind of request would not require strategic review." Her hands tightened slightly on the station edge. It did not require Draven's authority to deny. It required only processing. Rael understood. He understood very precisely. "He didn't have to deny it," Rael said. "He chose to." Thessaly said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He didn't confront Draven. Not that day. He went back to his rooms, sat by the window, watched the city for a long time, doing nothing in particular except existing in the ordered, careful way Arundel's city existed. He thought about 33 years of a particular story he left. He didn't come back. He chose something else over us that he had carried as fact. He thought about what it meant when the story turned out to have a page he hadn't been given. His father had not simply stayed. His father had tried to leave, had asked, had gone through proper channels and waited for an answer that came back as no stamped with a bureaucrat's signature. And then what stayed in that facility? Kept treating people, kept sharing food, kept telling terrible jokes to a young alien soldier learning to breathe through pain, kept being the same person. Even after the answer was no, most people would have. He stopped. He didn't know what most people would have done. He didn't know what he would have done. He knew what Dorian Voss had done. He'd stayed the same, all the way to the end. Rael pressed his palm flat against the window glass, felt the cool surface, the faint vibration of the city's systems beneath it. He thought, "I spent 33 years angry at the wrong story." He thought, "How do you grieve something you weren't even grieving correctly?" He thought, "I don't know. I genuinely don't know." He stayed at the window for a long time. Draven came to him that evening. No aide this time. Just the man himself appearing at Rael's door with the bearing of someone who had made a decision about how this conversation would go and was not interested in alternative framings. Rael opened the door, looked at him. "You found it," Draven said. Not a question, not an accusation, just acknowledgement. "Come in," Rael said. Draven came in, stood in the center of the room, did not sit, the specific posture of someone who needed to remain vertical for this. I will not pretend the decision was easy, Draven said. I'm not asking you to. Or that it was made carelessly. I'm not asking about that either. Rael looked at him. I want to know one thing. Draven waited. Did you know who he was when you denied it? Rael said. Did you read the name? A pause. Yes, Draven said. Did you know he was the one who was keeping people alive in there? The medic everyone in that facility depended on. Another pause. Longer. I knew a medic had become significant, Draven said. To morale, to survival rates. I was advised that removing him could destabilize the facility population. Rael stared at him. So you denied the request, Rael said slowly, partly because he was too useful where he was. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Draven did not look away. He did not deflect. Whatever else he was apparently not a man who ran from the specific gravity of what he'd done. The decision served the broader population of that facility, Draven said. The numbers? He was a person, Rael said, quiet, not raised, quieter than anger usually came. Not a number, not a stabilizing factor. A person who wanted to come home. Draven absorbed that. Yes, he said at last. Just that. Yes. The silence lasted long enough to become something. Then Draven said, I have spent 12 years on this council. I have made decisions that saved lives I can count and cost lives I cannot stop counting. Every man in my position carries a ledger that does not balance. A pause. I am not asking for absolution. Good, Rael said, because I don't have any to give. I am telling you, Draven said, adjusting that the decision was made within the limits of what I understood then, and that those limits were insufficient. Rael looked at him. At this man who had stamped a form 15 years ago and gone on with his career, who had built 12 years of service to a queen whose survival had been partly purchased by the same man his decision had kept in a prison until it was too late, who had walked in here tonight without being asked, who was standing in the center of a room he wasn't comfortable in not running. Rael thought this is what it looks like when someone doesn't have a good answer and knows it. He didn't know his father well enough to know what Dorian would have done in this moment. That was the thing. That was the new thing he was still getting used to. He didn't know his father. He'd thought he did. Thought he'd known the shape of him well enough to fill in the silences with a story that fit his own anger. But the man Thessaly described, the man who'd filed a request and stayed steady after the answer came back wrong, the man who'd told terrible jokes in the dark to keep people human. That man was a stranger. A stranger Rael was only now beginning to actually meet. I'm going to tell her, Rael said. Draven nodded once. I assume so. She deserves to know all of it. Yes, Draven said, she does. He straightened, moved toward the door, stopped, turned. He was exceptional, Draven said, not explaining, not justifying, just placing something in the record. Whatever my decision cost him, he was exceptional in a way that made the decision harder to live with, not easier. I want you to know I knew that. Rael said nothing. Draven left, the door sealed behind him. Rael stood in the quiet room and listened to the city humming below, and thought about the specific grief of people who had been wronged by someone who knew better and did it anyway and felt bad about it afterward. It wasn't nothing, it also wasn't enough. Both things were true. He told Thessaly that night. Found her on a balcony on the east side of the palace, a place he'd discovered by accident on day 2 and returned to for the sightline. The city spread below. The horizon curved where the planet did, stars just beginning to show at the upper edge of the atmosphere. She was standing at the railing. He came and stood beside her, and he told her. All of it. The document, the provision, the choice Draven had made and why, and the admission that had come without being extracted. She listened without interrupting. That was a quality he'd noticed about her. She didn't fill silences. She let them be what they were. When he finished, she stayed quiet for a moment. Then, I suspected something like this existed. Rael looked at her. You knew. I knew the denial was atypical for that type of request. She kept her gaze on the city. I did not look for the specific record until you arrived. I told myself it was because the records were difficult to access. A pause. That was not the only reason. He understood. You didn't want to find it. I did not want to find it, she said. Because finding it would require this. She gestured slightly. The conversation. The reckoning. Draven has served this government well for 12 years. The choices he made during the conflict period were not the only choices he has made. And undoing a person entirely based on what they were in the worst moments of a war. Is that what you'd be doing? She was quiet. I don't know, she said. I genuinely do not know. And there it was. The thing that made her real. Not the palace or the title or the composed way she occupied difficult moments. This. The actual honest uncertainty of someone trying to make a right decision without a clear template. Rael leaned on the railing. He told me this morning to leave, Rael said. Draven. He came to me and suggested my presence here was complicating things. I know. He was protecting himself. Yes. And also possibly not wrong about the complication. She looked at him, surprised slightly. You're defending him. No, Rael said. I'm saying he was doing three things at once, and one of them happened to be accurate. People usually are. She turned back to the city. What do you want me to do? She asked. Not as a queen asking for direction, as a person asking another person. Rael thought about that. About what Dorian Voss might want if wants could travel forward 15 years and land in balcony conversations between the son he'd tried to come home to and the soldier he'd helped survive. I don't think it's about what I want, Rael said. He's not here. I can't speak for him. I don't know him well enough. You know him better than you did a week ago. I know of him better. A pause. That's different. She considered that. The distinction seemed to matter to her, the precision of it. He filed a request, she said softly. He tried. Yes. He could have stopped. After the denial, he could have given up, become someone else. People do. He didn't. No. She looked at her own hands on the railing. He didn't. Rael watched the patrol craft moving below, their lights, their reliable arcs. Thessaly, he said. She looked at him. Whatever you decide about Draven, do it because it's right. Not because of my father. Not because of me. He met her gaze. He spent his whole life doing things because they were right, not because someone was watching. Don't make his memory into a reason to do something you'd have done differently on your own. She looked at him for a long moment. You pisho, she said, are considerably more complicated than you pretend to be. I know, Rael said. It's exhausting. They almost smile again, closer this time, more real. The stars were fully out now. This far from the city center they were visible. Not many, but enough. He wrote about you, she said. Rael went still. You mentioned, not what I told you before, specifically. She turned slightly toward him. Not just I have a child and I worry. There was more. Things he said over months. Pieces. She paused. He said you had his eyes. He said you were stubborn in a way that would either save you or exhaust everyone who knew you. He said... She stopped. What? He said he hoped you would find something worth staying for. The city below continued its careful, ordered business. Rael said nothing for a long time. Then did he? Yes. He looked at the stars, at the specific improbability of being here. This balcony, this planet, this woman who had known a version of his father he would never meet and was offering him the pieces of it the way you offered things that were both a gift and a wound. He didn't stay, Rael said. His voice was steady, mostly. For me, he left. He tried to come back. I know that now. A pause. It's still, yes, she said. I know. She didn't say it's okay, or you can let it go, or any of the things people said when they wanted grief to wrap up and become something more manageable. She just said, I know, and left it there. Rael breathed. The night air was cool, faintly ionized, clean in a way that felt tonight less suspicious and more just clean. I'm not leaving tomorrow, he said. I know that too, she said. I'm not staying because of a debt, or because of him, or because of complicated palace politics. Why then? He thought about it, genuinely. Because I've been passing through places my whole life, he said. And this is the first one where I found out something true, about someone I thought I knew. He paused. I'd like to find out a few more things before I go. She was quiet. What kind of things? She asked. The kind that take time, Rael said. And bad jokes, and probably a lot of meals in a palace that feeds people too well. Something happened to her face then. Brief, real, the first full smile he'd seen from her. Not the almost something he'd cataloged over 4 days. The actual thing. It changed her completely. The way light changed water suddenly entirely without warning. He laughed. Actual laugh, surprised out of him. She didn't laugh, but her eyes did something that was close enough. The kitchen, she said, will be relieved to hear it. And that was enough. More than enough for one evening on a balcony on a planet he'd never meant to land on. He went back to his rooms. The ceiling offered him its star field. He accepted it this time. Didn't mentally argue with it. Just lay back and let it do its thing. He thought about his father. Not the version he'd carried for 30 years, the shadow, the absence, the unanswered question with a human shape. That version was still there. He didn't think it would ever fully leave. 30 years was a long time to carry something, and the grooves went deep. But beside it now, alongside it, another version. A man in a cold facility who filed a form and waited for an answer that came back wrong. Who got up the next morning and made the same choice he'd always made, to be present, to be steady, to be the same person in the dark that he was in the light. Who told terrible jokes? Who thought about a child with his eyes? Who hoped that child would find something worth staying for? Rael looked at the stars on his ceiling. He thought, I don't know you. He thought, I'm starting to. He thought, that's going to have to be enough. Outside Arundel held its careful shape. Ordered. Lit. Going about its long, slow business. The drive coupling he'd installed 2 days ago hummed somewhere in the ship, doing its job. Ready, he wasn't. Not yet. But for the first time in 33 years, he understood why. And that, he thought, was somewhere to start. Part 3, what he tried to come home. To the council chamber had a ceiling that showed real-time stellar positions. Rael noticed this because it was the kind of detail you noticed when you were standing in a room full of people who were deciding what to do with you, and you needed somewhere neutral to look. Stars. Good. Stars didn't have opinions about his presence on Arundel. Everything else in the room did. There were 11 council members, seated in a curved arrangement that managed to feel both deliberate and organic, like the room itself had been designed to make individuals feel small and the collective feel inevitable. Floating data displays hovered at each position. Formal, dense, the architecture of serious decisions made slowly by serious people. Thessaly stood at the center, not sitting, standing. The specific posture of someone who had called this meeting and intended to remain in control of it. Draven sat at the far end of the curve, still, his face arranged into the practiced neutrality of a man who had attended many meetings that were nominally about one thing and actually about another. This meeting was nominally about Rael's continued presence on Arundel. It was actually about 15 years of a story that had been missing a page. Rael stood slightly to one side, not at the center. He hadn't asked to be here. Thessaly had told him that morning, simply and directly, the council meets today. You should be present. He'd looked at her. As what? As yourself, she'd said. That's enough. He'd thought it's usually not, but he'd come. The council member who spoke first had a voice like official correspondence. Measured, precise, the kind of voice that had spent decades making complicated things sound simple and simple things sound complicated. The concern, he said, is not the individual. The concern is the signal. Murmurs, agreement textured into the air. A human drifter given extended palace access. Private audiences with the queen. Integration into daily palace life. He paused. This will be observed by allied systems. By systems that are not allied. The interpretation will not be what we intend. What will the interpretation be, Thessaly asked? That Arundel's governance is guided by personal sentiment rather than strategic consideration. Quiet. The kind of quiet that meant people agreed but weren't sure they should say so. Rael kept his gaze on the stellar display above, found a cluster he recognized, focused on it. Don't speak yet, he told himself. Wait, or don't wait. You've never been good at waiting. Wait. Another council member. There is also the question of precedent. If the Queen's private debts become public policy. This is not policy, Thessaly said. It will be read as such. Then Thessaly said very calmly, we will need to be clearer about what it is. Rael looked down from the ceiling. At her. At the way she was holding this room. Not forcing it, not performing, just holding it. The way someone held something fragile and heavy at the same time with both hands, no sudden movements. He thought she's been doing this for 12 years. He thought this is what governing actually looks like when someone is good at it. He thought my father would have liked her. He couldn't stop that thought no matter how many times it arrived. Draven spoke next. His voice was different in this context, still controlled. But there was something underneath it now. Something that hadn't been there the previous evening in Rael's room, or if it had been, it was buried deeper. There is a matter, Draven said, that the council should have been informed of earlier. The room adjusted, subtle. The particular shift of people who had been expecting something and felt it arriving. The denial of a prisoner exchange request, Draven continued, 15 years ago, under conflict period authority. A request filed through humanitarian provision by a field medic at the Verath facility. No one spoke. I signed that denial, Draven said. I made that decision, and I have reviewed it since and found it insufficient. The word landed like something dropped from a height, insufficient. Not wrong exactly, not a crime, not an admission of malice, just insufficient. A man in his position using the most he could manage. Rael watched the room, watched the council members process. Some surprised, some already calculating what this meant for everything downstream. Some looking at Draven with an expression that might have been respect and might have been something more complicated. Thessaly said nothing. She'd known this was coming. They'd spoken early that morning. Rael had suggested, not demanded, suggested that Draven be given the opportunity to speak first, to place it in the record himself. She'd looked at him for a long moment. You're giving him a chance, she'd said. Someone once told me, Rael had said, that most problems could be survived if you had enough curiosity left to want to see what came next. She'd looked at him very carefully. He said that, she'd said quietly. I'm told he said it to everyone. Rael had shrugged. Maybe it even works. Now Draven finished, set down the weight of it. And the chamber had the quality of a room that had been rearranged by something and wasn't sure where all the furniture was yet. Then a council member, older toward the far end of the curve, said, why is this relevant now? And the room looked at Rael. He hadn't planned to speak. He really hadn't. But the question was in the air, and it was his question to answer or not answer. And he'd spent enough of his life choosing not that the alternative felt worth trying. He stepped forward, not to the center, just forward, enough to be unambiguously present. Dorian Voss filed that request because he wanted to come home, Rael said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. He had a kid at home who was 9 years old. He had a life he'd left to do work he believed in places that needed doing. He was not a soldier. He was a medic. He went where the work was, and then he tried to come back. The room listened. Quiet, real quiet, the kind that wasn't calculated. He didn't make it, Rael said. That's the fact of it. He didn't make it back. And I grew up thinking he'd chosen not to, that he'd chosen something else over us. A pause, shorter than it felt. Turns out the story had a page I hadn't been given. He looked at Draven, not accusatory, just direct. I'm not here to relitigate a decision made 15 years ago by a man under pressures I don't fully understand. I'm not here to be compensation for a debt or a symbol for anyone's politics. He looked around the room, at the faces, at the stellar display above them. I came to Arendal because my ship broke down. I stayed because I found out something true about someone I'd spent 30 years misunderstanding. He stopped, thought about stopping there, decided not to. Your queen saved her own life, he said. In that facility, with whatever she had available. My father helped her. That's real. But she came back and built something with it. That's hers. What she did with surviving, that's entirely hers. He looked at Thessaly. The debt isn't mine to collect, he said. And it's not really yours to pay. Some things aren't debts. They're just what happened, what people did for each other in the dark when no one was watching. The room was very still. Draven at the far end of the curve was looking at his hands. One council member, the voice-like official correspondence one, cleared his throat, said nothing, cleared it again. Thessaly spoke. The council will note, she said, her voice precise and warm simultaneously, which was a combination Rael had decided was her specific superpower. That Commander Draven has placed a 15-year-old decision in the formal record for review. That review will proceed through appropriate channels. She paused. And the council will also note that our guest has chosen to speak not as a claimant, but as a witness. She looked at Rael, something in her eyes that he was still learning to read. That matters, she said, to this chamber and to this government. After the meeting dissolved slowly the way institutional gatherings dissolved, with the gradual dispersal of people who needed to process separately what they'd experienced collectively, Rael found himself alone in the corridor outside the chamber. He leaned against the wall, breathed. That was, he thought, a significant amount of words for someone who doesn't like making speeches. You did fine. Did I? You're still standing. That's the baseline. Fair. A door opened beside him. Not the main chamber doors, a smaller one he hadn't noticed. And Thessaly came through it and stood in the corridor beside him with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been in enough meetings to know exactly which exit moved fastest. Well, Rael said. Well, she said. How bad was that? It was not bad. You're being diplomatic. I am always diplomatic, she said. It was genuinely not bad. He looked at her. She looked at him. The corridor was empty. The palace hummed its steady hum. Draven, he said. Will be reviewed, she said. Fairly, with full context, as should have happened earlier. You suspected something, Rael said, not accusing, observing. For 12 years. I suspected, she said carefully, that the conflict period decisions were not all clean, and I chose to govern with what I had rather than excavate what I didn't want to find. She met his gaze directly. That was a failure of a different kind. He nodded, not agreement exactly, recognition. We're all carrying files we haven't opened yet, Rael said. She looked at him. That is either very wise or a very good excuse for avoidance. Can it be both? The almost smile. Closer every time. He went to the archive that afternoon. Alone. The archivist let him in with the slightly bewildered courtesy Rael had come to recognize as Arundel's default setting, for we're not sure of the protocol, but we're committed to being gracious about it. He sat at the reading station, pulled up everything he could find. Not about the denial, not about Draven, not about the conflict period or the facility at Verath, or the records that had been sealed and unsealed and reviewed. About Dorian Voss. There wasn't much. Field medics in humanitarian service didn't generate a lot of archival material. But there were fragments, a service record from the organization he'd worked with, a citation, not an award, just a notation from a field supervisor who'd written in the specific, terse language of operational reports, exceptional sustained performance under adverse conditions. Recommend commendation pending operational review. The review never happened. The operational period ended. The commendation stayed pending forever. There was a photograph, single image, taken at some kind of organizational gathering, a conference or a deployment briefing, or something similarly institutional. 20 or 30 people arranged with the careful informality of group photos where no one quite knows where to put their hands. Rael found his father immediately. Third from the left, standing, slightly taller than the people beside him. The same eyes Rael saw in mirrors, the specific shape of them, the slight downward tilt at the outer corners, that made people who didn't know him think he was sad when he was just existing. He was laughing in the photo, at something off camera, turned slightly toward whoever had said whatever had made him laugh. Open, unguarded. The laugh of someone who had not yet learned to edit his own expressions in public. Rael stared at the photograph for a long time. He thought, there you are. He thought, there you actually are. He thought you looked like someone who tells terrible jokes. He thought you looked like someone I could have known. He looked at the laugh, at the eyes, at the hands mid-gesture explaining something to someone beside him, and thought about those same hands distributing rations in a cold facility to people who needed them more. Teaching someone to breathe through pain, filing a form through proper channels, and waiting for an answer that came back wrong and getting up the next morning anyway. He thought you were a stranger who happened to be my father. He thought, I'm just starting to meet you. He thought, I'm sorry it took this long. He closed the image, sat with that for a moment, then opened it again. Because some things you needed to look at twice before they were real. Thessaly found him there at hour 3. She didn't ask what he was reading. She sat across from him at the wide reading station and looked at the image on the display and was quiet in the way she was quiet when she meant for quiet to say something. "He looks like you," she said at last. "Everyone keeps saying that because it is true." "The eyes," Rael said, "and the way you hold yourself when you think no one is paying attention," she said, "slightly more open than when you know they are." He looked at her. "You've been paying attention." "Yes," she said simply, not embarrassed, not performing, just honest. He looked back at the photograph. "Do you have anything else?" he asked. "From then, from Varath, anything he said, anything you remember." She thought. And then she did something he hadn't expected. She talked. Not in the careful, managed way she'd talked in the palace rooms. Not with the composed distance of someone protecting themselves from the weight of memory. She talked like someone who had been holding things in storage for 15 years and had finally found somewhere safe to put them down. She told him about mornings, the specific quality of mornings in that facility, how light came in wrong at wrong angles in a way that made time feel unreliable. How Dorian had started the practice of saying out loud every morning what day it was. Not because anyone would remember, because hearing someone say it made time feel real again. She told him about a joke that had been so poorly constructed that a guard had involuntarily laughed, and then looked furious at himself for laughing, which had made everyone in the room laugh harder than the joke warranted, which had made the guard leave, which had briefly improved conditions by one small humane margin. She told him about the day she'd asked Dorian why he kept helping people who had nothing to give him back. And Dorian had looked at her with those downward tilted eyes and said, "Because the point was never what I get back. The point is what I want to be while I'm here." Rael sat with that sentence for a long time. "The point is what I want to be while I'm here." He turned it over, looked at it from different angles. He thought he knew he might not make it out. He thought he decided who he was going to be anyway. He thought 33 years, and I've been moving in the opposite direction, staying unattached, staying portable, deciding not to be anything in particular to anyone so that leaving would be clean. He thought that's one way to do it. He thought it's not the only way. That evening, Thessaly came to his rooms. She carried something. He saw it when the door opened, held in both hands carefully. An envelope. Old. The material had the particular quality of things that had been kept rather than forgotten. Protected, deliberately. She held it out to him. He looked at it. "What is this?" he asked. "He gave it to someone who was released," she said. "Before the end. A woman who had been held for a shorter period. She was released through a different channel, not the exchange request. A separate negotiation." She paused. "She kept it. For years. She found me 8 years ago when I was making a public visit to a memorial event. She brought it and said it had been meant for someone, and she hadn't known who, and she thought I would." Rael looked at the envelope. His name wasn't on it. There was nothing on it, just the envelope itself. Old. Kept. "She didn't know you existed," Thessaly said, "but she knew it was meant for someone who wasn't there." He took it, felt the weight of it, sat down. Thessaly moved to the window, turned her back not to be dismissive, to give him something. Privacy in a shared room. He opened the envelope. The handwriting was his father's. He knew it from the one box of things left behind, a single card, a partial note old enough that the paper had gone soft at the edges. He'd looked at that handwriting enough times to know it the way you knew the face of someone you'd never spent enough time with. The letter was 3 pages. Not long by the measure of 3 pages. The handwriting was small, the lines close. The work of someone writing with care and limited materials and the specific urgency of things that needed to be said to someone who wasn't there. He read it. He read it twice. He would read it many more times in the years to come, in his ship, between systems in various rooms, on various planets at various ages, with various amounts of accumulated understanding. The letter would mean different things at different times. That was the nature of letters from people you're still learning. But the first time he read it, and something happened in his chest that had no clean name. Something that lived in the space between grief and recognition, and something softer than either. Something that arrived quietly and stayed. His father had written about the facility, about the work, about the people, about the specific challenge of trying to maintain any kind of dignity in a place designed to remove it, and how sometimes the best resistance was just to be exactly yourself and refuse to let circumstances make you smaller. He had written about a young alien soldier with long ears and frightened eyes who had stopped being frightened and started being furious, and how furious was better. How furious was something you could work with. He had written, and this was the page where Rael had to stop and look at the ceiling and breathe for a moment, about a boy with his eyes. "I think about you every morning," the letter said. "I don't say that to make you feel obligated to anything. I say it because it's true, and because I've decided that true things should be said out loud when possible, especially to people who matter. You matter. That's not a small thing. I know I left without explaining it properly. I know 9 years old is a terrible age to be left without explanation. I know you are probably angry. You have a right to be. Anger at the right things is just love that hasn't found its shape yet. I tried to come back. That matters to me that you know that. I tried. If you're reading this, and I hope you are, I hope this finds you somewhere good, somewhere with enough to eat, and someone who makes you laugh, then someone else got out and carried this forward. Which means people are still doing for each other what people can do, which is everything. That's all it ever is. Just people doing what they can for each other when the circumstances are bad. You don't have to forgive me. You don't have to understand. You don't have to carry this forward as obligation. But I genuinely hope that you find something worth staying for, because you have my eyes and presumably some version of my stubbornness. And if you're anything like me, you've probably been moving for a long time and telling yourself that's just who you are. It might not be. It might just be who you became. There's a difference. I love you. That's the end of the letter, and also the beginning and the whole middle. Dad. Rael sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. The room was very quiet. The ceiling offered its starfield. He let it. At the window, Thessaly stood with her back to him, looking at the city. Patient, present, not hovering, not filling the space with anything it didn't need. He looked at the letter one more time, at the handwriting, at the specific formation of the letters, the way the Y curved, the way the DE reached slightly upward, the signature at the bottom. Dad, not Dorian, not Dr. Voss, not the name on the archived photograph, the name on the service record, the name on the exchange request form stamped, denied by a man who had called the decision insufficient and had not been wrong about that part. Just Dad. He folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, held it in both hands the way Thessaly had held it when she'd brought it to him. Then he said to the room, to the ceiling, to the starfield and the city and the planet he'd never meant to land on, "Okay. Just that, okay." Thessaly turned. She looked at him, at his face, at whatever was on it. She didn't look away from it, whatever it was. "He wrote about you," Rael said. "I know," she said. "I have read it." He looked up. "You read it." She, the woman who brought it to me, she opened it when she received it. Not out of disrespect. She needed to know who it was for. A pause. She gave me the letter when she couldn't find the person it was meant for. She wanted me to hold it until that person appeared. 8 years, Rael said. 8 years. You kept it for 8 years. Yes. He looked at her, at this woman who had kept a dead man's letter for 8 years, on the possibility that the person it was meant for might someday appear. Who had built a planet's worth of governance around the things she'd learned in a cold facility from a man who told terrible jokes and shared his food. He wrote that you stopped being frightened and became furious instead, Rael said, and that he thought furious was better. She was quiet for a moment. He said that third page. Something moved through her expression. Old. Real. He was right, she said. Fury was something I could use. A pause. I have been using it ever since. Toward better ends, I hope. From what I can see, Rael said yes. She moved away from the window, came and sat across from him. No distance this time. Just two people in a room with an old letter between them and a city going about its careful and different business outside. What will you do, she asked, with the letter, with all of it? He thought about that, genuinely. Not the deflection version, not the I'll figure it out he deployed in 1,000 port conversations when people asked questions he didn't want to sit with. The real version. I think, he said slowly, I'm going to learn to stop moving long enough to let things catch up to me. She looked at him. That sounds difficult, she said. Extremely, he said. I've been moving since I was 9. Stopping feels like a skill I'll have to actually learn. Skills can be learned, she said. According to my father, most problems can be survived if you have enough curiosity left to want to see what comes next. She looked at him. He looked at her. The city moved below them, the stars above, everything in between. Stay, she said. Not a command, not an official request. Just a word from one person to another. Not as a symbol, she added. Not as a debt settlement, not as his son. As you. I'm still figuring out who that is, Rael said. I know, she said. So am I. Figuring out who I am without the weight of what I've been carrying. A pause. Perhaps that is easier with company. He looked at her for a long moment, at the pale gold hair, the white birch skin, the long ears angled slightly back, caution he'd learned. Not hostility, never hostility. Just the particular posture of someone who had learned to be careful with the things they let themselves want. He understood that completely. All right, he said. All right, I'll stay for a while. He paused. I want it noted that I am terrible at formality, and I will not be in any portraits. And if your floor is going to keep following me around with that light, I'd like some advance warning. She breathed, not a sigh. Something more like relief, making a small, quiet exit through a door that had been closed for a long time. The floor, she said, is simply polite. It's judgmental, Rael said. Supportively judgmental. Those are not mutually exclusive. No, he agreed. They're really not. 2 weeks later, Rael Voss stood at the landing platform. His ship, still slightly battered, stubbornly functional. The drive coupling he'd installed was holding. The coolant levels were correct. The palace maintenance team had handled it with a slightly bewildered graciousness that had become their standard mode for anything involving him. The ship looked exactly the same as it always had. He didn't. He knew this because Thessaly had said that morning over the breakfast. The kitchen delivered with such quiet precision, you looked different than when you arrived. He'd looked at her. Different how? Less like someone leaving, she'd said. He'd thought about that. Less like someone leaving. He'd spent 42 years looking like someone leaving, even when he was standing still, even when he was technically staying somewhere. The posture of departure, the slight lean toward exits, the practiced readiness of someone for whom staying was always conditional and leaving was always possible, and that was the way you survived when you'd learned early that things didn't last. Now standing at the platform with his ship in front of him, in the city of Arundel arranged below, in the particular morning light of this planet cooler than he was used to, more blue than gold, he tried to identify what had changed. The letter was in his jacket, inner pocket. Close, he'd keep it there for a while, until the keeping became habit and the habit became something else. Something he didn't have a word for yet but recognized the shape of. He heard footsteps behind him. Thessaly. No guards today, no aides, just her in simpler clothes. Pale gold hair loosed the morning light, doing what morning light did to things that were worth looking at. She stopped beside him, looked at the ship. It's smaller than I imagined, she said. It's bigger on the inside, Rael said. Metaphorically. Literally. No, literally it's exactly as cramped as it looks. She made a sound that was almost something, getting closer every time. They stood in silence for a moment. The city below continued its careful, ordered, beautiful business. Arundel doing what Arundel did, being precisely what it had decided to be, without apology or excess. Draven's review, Rael said. Proceeding, she said. Fairly, as it should. And him, he will answer for what he chose, she said, within the context of who he chose to be afterward as well. Both things. A pause. That is how it should work. Yeah, Rael said. It is. The morning air moved between them. He thought my father chose who he wanted to be and was that person all the way through. He thought I've been choosing to be portable, provisional, present but not committed. He thought that's also a choice. I just didn't know I was making it. I'll be back, Rael said. I know, she said. I need to He gestured vaguely at the ship, at the sky, at the general concept of the routes between systems. There are things, loose ends, a cargo contract I didn't finish, a debt of my own from a system I'd rather settle properly than avoid indefinitely. He paused. And I need to move for a bit. Moving helps me think, and I have a lot to think about. Take the time you need, she said. That's a reasonable response. I have been told I can be reasonable. By who? Occasionally by the council, she said. More often by the kitchen staff. He laughed, real, surprised out of him the way the good ones always were. She almost laughed, the closest yet. He reached up and touched the tattoo on his neck. The old habit, the reflexive reach. But this time he held his hand there for a moment, felt the lines, the numbers, the credential of a man who had carried it into difficult places and remained through all of it exactly who he decided to be. The point is, what I want to be while I'm here. He took his hand down. If anyone asks, he said, why you run the way you do, why you govern with the things you govern with, tell them it's because someone showed you that kindness doesn't require an audience. Her ears angled back. He knew that gesture now, knew what it meant. And if anyone asks what became of his son, she said, he grinned. Tell them he finally figured out the difference between moving and running. He turned toward the ramp. And he's working on it. The hatch sealed behind him with its familiar sound. He settled into the pilot seat, ran the pre-launch checks with the automatic confidence of long practice. The drive coupling engaged. The coolant readings were nominal. The systems reported back clean and ready with the quiet satisfaction of machines doing what they were designed for. He brought up the nav display, looked at the routes, the systems, the long branching possibilities of space that had always felt to him like freedom, and sometimes like hiding. He set a course, not fixed permanently, not forever, just a direction. For now. He looked back through the viewport. Thessaly stood alone on the platform. No guards behind her, no aides. Just her and the morning light in the city she had built out of surviving, and the long ears catching the early blue gold of Arundel's particular dawn. She was not waiting. She was just watching. The ship lifted, rose above the ordered city, above the layered platforms and the threading transit pods and the careful geometry of a place that had decided what it was and committed to it completely. Into the upper atmosphere, the blue-gold light thinning into the dark edge of space. Into the dark, stars opened ahead of him. Uncountable, patient, vast. He thought not empty. He thought wide. He touched the letter through his jacket, felt the edge of the envelope. 3 pages of handwriting that had waited 8 years to find him, kept safe by a woman who'd understood that some things were meant for someone even when you didn't know who that someone was yet. He thought, I know who you were now. He thought, I'm going to be someone worth knowing too. He thought, I'm going to work on that. The ship moved into open space with the settled, purposeful feeling of something that knew where it was going. For the first time in 42 years, so did Rael Voss. Not forever, not with certainty. Just for now, in this moment, with this particular direction, in this particular letter close to his chest, in this particular planet growing smaller in the viewport behind him. Which was, he thought, exactly how his father would have started. One morning at a time, one choice at a time, one small, deliberate act of being exactly who you decided to be, all the way through.